In order to effectively address climate change, companies need to set metrics and targets. These measures should be set based on an assessment of the dependencies and impacts which exist in the value chain. This can seem like a potentially large and daunting exercise, but it's important to be pragmatic about what can be achieved. Metrics and targets should be developed incrementally, over time, not all in one go. When developing metrics and targets, it's important to align them with the metrics and targets used in wider risk management and strategy development. This way, there is a common language for articulating all the threats that exist to the business. The level of vulnerability and existing capability to deal with climate change is going to vary from business to business. Each business needs to focus on the most important risks for them. Where practical, seeking subject matter expertise in relation to a specific risk can be really useful. This will help companies determine the correct metrics and targets and also challenge underlying assumptions. It's a good idea to start with a qualitative assessment, then quantification, and finally consider adopting a system such as an alternative profit or loss statement that monetizes environmental costs. It may also be helpful to run trials at the project level, as opposed to attempting an organization-wide rollout. Metrics and targets for climate-related risk should reflect the impact of both physical and transition risks. For example, it's just as important to measure the regulatory and reputational risks arising from the company's environmental performance as it is to measure dependencies and impacts on natural capital. A dependency describes how a specific business activity relies on certain resources or capitals. Impacts describe how a specific business activity results in changes to resources or capitals. Dependencies and impacts are going to occur throughout the supply chain, so when selecting metrics, it's important to carefully define the scope and boundaries of material risks. Companies will get a better overall picture of climate-driven risk if they draw boundaries more broadly and consider the dependency and impact pathways up and down the value chain, as opposed to a core business activity. But it's important to remember that how companies define their boundaries and scope will also have a significant impact on what they will measure and how they will measure it. Questions to consider include: what primary or secondary data currently exists to enable measurement? What tools and frameworks have been developed, which could be leveraged for metric development? What baseline should be measured? What time horizons will be used for measurement and in setting targets? What discount rate will be applied over time? What tech developments could enhance measurement? But there is another question to address when it comes to defining the scope and boundaries of metrics. This is the circularity of dependencies and impacts. The basic idea of circularity is that businesses' activities will often impact the very resources they rely on. Clothing manufacturing is an industry that's highly dependent on natural capital. It's also an industry that has a huge impact on the natural capital it is dependent upon. For example, industry carbon emissions and deforestation both accelerate climate change, and the release of pollutants into the soil damages biodiversity and the ecosystem. All of these things have the combined effect of reducing the crop yields on which the industry depends. Hotels and other leisure companies also have very particular dependencies on physical infrastructure and local biodiversity as a driver of business. Take a hotel located on the coast next to the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, Australia, for example. Greenhouse gas emissions arising from activities throughout the value chain contribute to the effects of climate change. The Queensland coast is particularly vulnerable to cyclones, and there is a risk of increased frequency and intensity of these events. This, in turn, can lead to physical damage of the hotel through storm surges, wind and flooding. and also reduce the appeal of the location as a holiday destination. Water pollution and runoff from hotel sites can impact local marine biodiversity, and even high levels of tourism can adversely affect the reefs, again reducing the appeal of the area as a place to visit. The picture that emerges here is that the tourism and leisure industry can pose a very threat to the natural capital it is reliant upon. The beverage industry also provides a very clear example of the circularity of dependencies and impacts. This is because the very resource the industry relies upon, water, can be affected both directly and indirectly by the industry's activities. For example, pollution and runoff from a manufacturing plant can directly impact the local water supply. Where this happens, water might have to be sourced from far away, resulting in additional costs to the business. CO2 emissions from the manufacturing will also contribute to the effects of climate change. This could indirectly lead to lower rainfall in the catchment area, reducing the plant's supply of fresh water. Where water extraction exceeds natural inputs through rainfall, freshwater consumption might become unsustainable, not just for the business in question, but across a whole region.